Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode. Inshallah, today I'm hoping to discuss the issue of children, that is bringing up children, and particularly bringing up children in the Western context. Of course, as you know, as humans, but also as Muslims, children are such an important part of our families, of our communities, and so precious to us. You know, Islamically, children are given rights, are cherished. They are quite literally our future. And a lot of our Muslim cultures and our heritage cultures treasure and put a lot of affection and love. So when it comes to bringing them up in our own families, but in our wider communities, sometimes we become very fearful, and particularly when we're operating in a context that we perhaps don't understand that well, or perhaps are just fearful that certain cultural practices in our Western societies, or certain attitudes or dangers or kind of criminal activities might somehow affect the way that our children understand the world or could become involved. It makes us sometimes retreat. And the will to protect our children becomes, it kind of shifts into a more negative light, where we actually attempt to control and sometimes restrict our children and the kind of experiences that they might have, which doesn't necessarily equip them to operate successfully in their countries, in the societies in which they are being brought up. So these are the kind of issues I'd like to talk about. But actually, I think it's interesting to start at the very beginning of a child's life. And what does Islam say about this, and how does that interact with the kind of Western framework in which we operate? For example, babies. When I first became a mother, I was really not prepared. Of course, members of families, my family and friends have had children, and I've been around children as you know, all my life. But actually having a baby, you know, there you are with this little bundle, and suddenly there's an awful lot of advice being thrown at you. Now, some of that advice is very useful, some of it is less so, and some of it is extremely confusing. And especially when cultural and kind of ideas that people believe are Islamic come into it, we begin to get very confused, especially new mothers. You know, is bringing up our baby really this difficult? Is it really this complicated? Are there really things going to damage the baby in a way that, you know, is irreversible if I don't do a particular cultural ritual or these kind of things, which sometimes are actually not Islamic and actually against the kind of Islamic framework in terms of superstitions. And so it's a confusing time. But there are certain things that are very clear, and that within the Islamic framework, and that is really, for a start, the concept of mercy and rahmah. Rahmah to the child, rahmah to the baby, and to the mother and the father is such an important element of how we kind of nurture and inform the whole world of a child. If it's full of love, and if it's full of people being gentle to a family and within families, this is a foundational concept. But there's also practical things with babies in particular. Now, in the West, there's been a lot of debate about kind of rules about bringing up babies. Now, that might be around you know, routines. That's one of the big things I think that young Western mothers and in Muslim countries too are faced with. This idea that you can somehow make a child more convenient, if you like, by making sure that it's in a routine, that you put it to bed at certain times, that you allow it to cry for certain lengths of times, and it becomes very regimented, almost a timetable for bringing up babies. Now, for some families this may well work, but for others it's quite an intimidating way of going about it. And the idea of letting a baby cry and cry and cry is something actually difficult to handle. And if we look at the Islamic framework, not necessarily something that we wish to do, and there's nothing wrong with not following these kind of cultural constructions of how to bring up a child, and particularly of a baby. So again, having the confidence and giving the confidence to young women, young mothers who are facing these struggles and facing the challenges of the early days of bringing up children, it's about support and not necessarily lecturing them on particular cultural traditions or particular kind of a doctrine of bringing up children, but really drawing on the Islamic principles to support them. Another practical element comes around breastfeeding, and this is something that I'm really wanting to talk about and passionate about, particularly because there's a trend within Muslim communities to actually not breastfeed at all, or breastfeed in a very limited time. We have very commercialised promotion all around the world, really, of formula feeding, and while this is absolutely a choice for many families and is necessary for some families to operate and work, it isn't an obligation. And within the Islamic framework, the beauty of a mother feeding the child and of nurturing the child and the health benefits that comes with that, as well as the emotional benefits, is something that needs to be supported. And again, in communities, we see strange trends where it's always been a natural thing. In many Muslim countries, even the most covered up woman will happily nurse her child. In the West, there's a very strange sexualization of the female body, where a woman nurturing her child, nursing the child, is suddenly seen as something immodest or strange in the public space, or indeed in our own homes. So it's important for us as Muslims not to get confused and not to get drawn into these kind of un-Islamic cultural understandings of the relationship between a baby and the mother, and also even the length of time of breastfeeding. There's obviously differences from theological interpretations, but 24 months being one of the times that's kind of celebrated within the Islamic framework is absolutely different from what's actually happening in our communities. So that's something, again, we need to support new mothers to nurture their children and to nurse them, and to really, think about the Islamic implications and the social and health benefits that these things come with. So that's another practical element. So really the nurturing of children. But once they've passed through babyhood and they turn into young children who are eager to explore the world, who are starting to perhaps go to nursery or beginning school, and that presents another big conundrum for many of us. We live in societies which sometimes have non-Islamic practices, or might have, a school might have many different religious children from very many different religious backgrounds, and sometimes our wish to protect children, particularly drawing upon, the hadith that talk about the need to protect children from the influences of bad friends, for example. The idea that we need to protect the vulnerability, the kind of the beautiful innocence and naivety of children, and to treasure that, but to protect it from bad ideas and from seeing bad practices. Sometimes this makes us shut down. Now, perhaps one of the beneficial things is that we see an increase of Muslims throwing out their televisions and banning their children from ever watching TV. Again, this is a debate that's being had, but really, what is this about? It's not only about the impact of what children are seeing on their screens and the kind of influences that they can get from computer, from the internet, browsing the internet, that we need to be wary of. But it's not necessarily banning things or stopping them from interacting. Again, I'm always having conversations, particularly interestingly with my dear Muslim brothers, about the issue around schooling, and should we be sending our children to schools which are not quote-unquote Islamic, or have children from different backgrounds. Again, the idea is that by sending children to non-Muslim majority schools, we are presenting them with a kind of minefield of problems, of different ideas, of non-Islamic practices and these kind of things. And of course, this is a natural response. But again, I think we need to sit down and really discuss what's going on and to what extent can we help this. For a start, it isn't practical to homeschool for many families, and it isn't necessarily either practical or desirable to go to an Islamic school. Sometimes there aren't schools run by Muslims or Islamic schools in an area, and sometimes they don't exist in some European countries at all, and sometimes they might not be nearly as good in terms of educational quality as non-Muslim state schools, for example. So things are not necessarily black and white, and things are not necessarily easy. So what is it that we can do to educate our children to be comfortable as little Muslims, as coming from Muslim families and Muslim communities, but to be able to interact? I remember I was teaching some young children their basic beliefs, Aqidah, Farda Ain Aqidah, and a little 5-year-old had started school, and we were talking about beliefs and religious beliefs, and the little boy told me that he understood. So I was teaching a small group of children around belief and Aqidah, and I was having a conversation with them. They're about age 5, 6. And the little boy recounted just how confused he was about religious belief and how to interact at school. He believed that Moses was God, and that Jesus was he believed the Christian, he'd understood the Christian understanding of Jesus being the Son of God. And he came from a very kind of quite a conservative Muslim family. And what struck me, and obviously the family and we talked to the little boy, and we tried to teach him gently around the Islamic conceptualization of theology and of belief and of Allah and Godhood. And but what really struck me from that particular episode was the kind of how we need to really strongly educate our children and make sure we're really clear. Sometimes we assume that children learn things by kind of osmosis, by absorbing things from around us, that they'll learn to pray by just watching others pray, or they'll learn to understand you know, what being Muslim means just by watching us. But we have to ask, are we really always the perfect role models? Are we always doing what is right? Or do we need to actually sit down and explain to children about the details of our faith, but also of how to, you know, understand other different beliefs, and that, you know, there are people who have different beliefs to us, different practices, and that doesn't make them more right than us or more wrong than us, but we need to, you know, understand that we have our own ideas and that we can be comfortable and confident with that. But to be explicit in our teachings, not just, you know, how to recite Quran, which is of course, mashallah, very important, but that is not the only beginning and the end of our education. So these are the kind of issues that I think we really need to get to grips with and have, you know, honest conversations with ourselves about, you know, how we want to bring up the children, and to what extent can we influence, not their environment, because we can't wrap them in cotton wool forever, but prepare them for life ahead. So I hope you'll join me after the break. We're going to be talking about older children and teenagers, which again is another stage, and the kind of issues that can occur and perhaps become more apparent when we're living in these Western contexts. So please, I look forward to joining you after the break. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break we were talking about bringing up children, and particularly supporting families and making choices when we first have new babies, but also the kind of choices and challenges that children growing up might face, and how we can support them in that. Particularly I'm interested in this idea of, you know, our instinct to protect our children can sometimes result in being in either trying to just keep them away from wider society, or as children grow up, and this is what I want to talk about now, particularly as teenagers, while we can't, you know, keep them away from society, we sometimes try to be very authoritarian and disciplinarian and try to control their movements and control their interactions in a bid to protect them. Now, I want to know what's going on here. First of all, sometimes it's because we fear the outside world. We fear non-Muslim culture, partly because we don't really always know much about it, and partly because on the news we see all sorts of issues happening. We see high rates of teenage pregnancies from premarital relations. We see drug addiction and drug abuse and very young children, smoking of cigarettes, but also use of alcohol, softer drugs such as cannabis, very common and very predominant in our Muslim communities as well, and this is something we have to admit to ourselves. And also even forms of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, and that involves forms of sexual grooming and also of prostitution and pimping. Now, it's very easy for ourselves to almost convince ourselves that our house is so clean and tidy, if you like, that this never happens in Muslim communities, and if we can just make sure our children, go from the home, go to school and come back again, that everything will be fine and they'll grow up entirely protected. Now the problem is, they don't live in a vacuum, and as much as we can try, actually restricting them, especially at a teenage time, can cause full-out rebellion, and we can lose our young people in terms of, and this has been on another episode, in very bad ways, in that they no longer wish to respect us or our family. So what is the positive way? What can we do about these issues? How can we address them? And how can we, when, for example, we have very strong commercial interests from the outside world, selling things through overtly sexualized behavior, for example, things are seen as very sexy and very positive. This is constantly sort of drummed into our youth. And non-Muslim youth and Muslim youth in general, this is a problem. Violence, the kind of normalisation of violence and what that does, whether it's from movies, computer games, and from out in the street. We live in unpeaceful societies. So again, does kind of try and locking them away really work? Of course it doesn't. We need to provide them with the tools to deal with it. And at the heart of this is a confidence and a love of their deen. If you have young Muslims who not only just identify as Muslim in the way of, I'm a Muslim and they're not, but as in, I'm a Muslim and I know my deen and I love my deen and I'm proud and I can stand in my classroom and I can say, well, actually, I'm a Muslim and I believe this, or I can be in they can be in the park sitting on the slides and the swings and the park benches as young people do. And if there's alcohol going around, then I can say, I don't want to be a part of this. I don't need to validate myself. I don't need to boost my self-esteem by having relationships with girls or boys, or taking alcohol to fit in with the crowd. That's often what young people want to be. They want to be the same as everyone else. And when they're different, it can be very difficult and very exclusionary. So we need to bolster their self-esteem. We need to make them feel confident and comfortable that they can be different and they can actually be respected by their peers. Okay, not by all their peers, but for people who are going to be, rejecting our young people because of their religious faith, well, they're not going to be good friends anyway. But making our young people understand that is the main thing. So rather than constantly lecturing or restricting them, let's have open and honest conversations. And that means dealing with subjects that we might feel concerned about. That might be talking about drugs. If we don't know about drugs, we need to go out. There's plenty of material out there that can help us. There are services within our societies and communities that we can draw upon to get information, so we can present this information honestly to our children and say, look, this is what is out there. This is what you are possibly going to come across. And I can't protect you from coming across it, but we can talk about how you deal with it and what are the consequences. And yes, we do make mistakes. And if you make mistakes, you can come to us. You can come to us as families, as mothers, as aunts, as community members, as mosque officials, and talk about these problems. Same with the hormones of teenage time are raging, and attraction to boys and girls is going to happen. So we need to address this. How do we deal with sexuality? Sometimes even the word sex is such a huge taboo in our communities. We don't want to share the same room as husband and wives. We don't want to talk about the physical development of young people's bodies. We don't want to talk about the relations that they might be having or wish to have. And if we don't face up to the fact that this is natural human behaviour and we need to understand how to deal with it and where we fit as Muslims, then we're going to get young people going off and doing things and getting into all sorts of trouble and not being able to draw upon our support and our guidance. So we need to sometimes face the facts, as difficult and uncomfortable as that can be, because we have to be there for our young people, we have to be there for our teenagers in order to help them be the, you know, the confident, successful Muslims that we want our community to be full of. And if our communities are going to, you know, grow and be leaders, we need to make sure that the young people have the tools to deal with the world we're living in. And we can wish that, you know, non-Muslim countries perhaps will emigrate, but actually if we look at Muslim countries, they're not all as perfect and as beautiful as sometimes we fantasise. These issues are there too. So really, before we finish, I want to reiterate that kind of core point, in that we need to provide spiritual, emotional and social guidance to our young people from the cradle all the way up until they hopefully leave our houses and make lives of their own in our communities and stay within our communities and love their heritage and love their deen. We need to think about not oppressive, dictatorial ways of interacting, but thinking about how we can make these Muslims, these young Muslims, bring them up with knowledge of their deen. And that is about the way we interact with them, with love and support and understanding and accepting mistakes, but also with education. That is such a crucial thing. It's not just about getting the grades at school. It's not just about, you know, making sure that their homework is perfect and getting upset if they have got, you know, they haven't got 98%, or even the opposite of that, not really caring about education because we're so obsessed with, you know, the economic development of our communities that we prefer our children to go out sometimes and work. Again, it's not about these kind of things, it's about educating them as human beings, as spiritual beings, to understand not just the rules of our deen, but the kind of the maqasid framework, the way that we can get the spirit of Islam as well as the outward appearances. So of course, we send our children to madrasa, we send our children to learn Quran and memorise texts and learn how to pray, but we have to make them understand what that means. Why are we doing this? Why are we worshipping Allah? And through our worship of Allah, how we interact with each other, interact with Muslims and also non-Muslims, and become really whole human beings, whole social beings. Because if we don't address all these things and we don't see education of our children and nurturing of our children as something that's very holistic, then we're going to end up with more of the problems where we see our young people in jail, committing crimes, getting into trouble, or even sometimes exiting both the community but also Islam. So just to summarise, bringing up children is something that, inshallah, many of us do over our lifetimes. And also it's not just about the key part of our families, okay, as mothers and fathers, but also as sisters and aunts, but also as community members. There's a famous phrase about, you know, it takes a whole community to bring up a child, and I think that's true. And in our busy lives, especially as we get more and more successful economically, it's very easy to let go of that and sometimes even retreat into the nuclear family, so that we're losing community. And if children don't feel rooted in those kind of social networks, if we don't feel that if we're in a shop or we see a young person acting badly and we know whose parents it is, we know this child, but we somehow can't feel, you know, that we can say something, that's a sad state of affairs. We need to make those bonds, not in an aggressive way, but in a guiding way. We have a responsibility to all of our children, to all of our communities, and that will play out in their lives as they grow in these Western contexts. So I hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and it's got some questions being raised, and we can think of practical ways to implement some of the kind of challenges that we face. So please join me next time for the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.